This is the Atlas Project. This is a weekly chapter-by-chapter reading group of Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged. Tonight we are discussing part 3, chapter 8, which is called The Egoist. And just so that you know a little bit about why we're doing this project, in large part, it's to promote the Atlas Shrugged essay contest that's sponsored by the Ayn Rand Institute. Deadlines for those essays are in May. We are coming close to being finished with this project. So if you are looking to catch up, you can look in the links in the comment section for this post to find out more about the contest, and also look at old recordings of what you've missed if you're just joining us for the first time. I also want to bring people up to date about some plans for how we're planning on ending this project. So we do just have 3 more chapters. And originally, when we conceived this, we thought that we would spend the Tuesday after our final broadcast, or at least the Tuesday after the final chapters broadcast, which would have been April 24th, doing a kind of overview of the book. But Greg decided in particular that wouldn't be enough time, wouldn't do justice to everything that there is to say in overview about the book. So we decided we would, instead of having the Tuesday night event be the big final finale, we would have a kind of capstone event on the preceding Sunday, April 22nd, for about 6 hours from 2 to 8 p.m., reflecting on a series of topics that are aimed at summing up and reflecting on the novel as a whole. We haven't yet decided the place, the location where these will happen, but we'll be posting more about that soon when we've found a place. It won't be at the usual location in New York. I will be there. It will be my last trip to New York. And then we will do one final broadcast on Tuesday on April 24th, but that will just be between Greg and me, tying up whatever loose ends came up from the seminars that we're having on the Sunday. So this is a chance for you to come to the live sessions in New York if you haven't had a chance to yet. We'll be getting a bigger room, hopefully, where we'll be able to accommodate a larger number of people. And if you're looking to take a trip to New York, this would be a good time to do it. I think that is all I wanted to say. Greg, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
No, April's a nice enough time in New York, a little showery, but I think there's a song. There's autumn in New York. Is there an April in New York? I don't remember. But we'll be here in...
April is the cruelest month.
April's the cruelest month as well. But we'll try to have a non-cruel April session. The idea is, we're gonna have a room for 6 hours. People will be there, we hope, for 6 hours, but we'll try to divide it into like what would be the equivalent of 3 episodes, and we'll have a topic for each, and we'll break, for coffee or whatnot in between them. Okay, so that's our plan for finishing up, and then after that, Ben and I will have just reflecting back on the project and tying up loose ends, just the 2 of us broadcast. So let me take us through a quick summary of this chapter, chapter 8, the anti-penultimate chapter. Since somebody on Facebook was going on about hating the word penultimate, I thought I'd do them one better. So we have our anti-penultimate chapter, chapter 8 of part 10. This is a chapter, it has 7 sequences. The first sequence is basically set in the room where Galt is given, where Mr. Thompson was supposed to broadcast from, and where Dagny and all the other luminaries of the society were hearing Galt's speech. And we get the immediate reactions of everybody in that room, including Dagny, and we get a little bit of their reactions continued talking about it after Dagny leaves. Then for sequence 2, we cut out into the street where we get a conversation between Dagny and Eddie. Eddie, of course, recognized the voice of John Galt speaking, and here's where, if we haven't realized it already, although we in this group have decided that we did realize it well before this, it's officially revealed that John Galt is the man that Eddie's been talking to in the cafeteria. And there's some discussion between Dagny and Eddie about that. We'll come to that in due course. In sequence 3, we kind of zoom out to the world and we get the societal effects of the speech over the couple of months that follow. And then at the end of that sequence, we get a meeting between Dagny and Mr. Thompson, where Dagny suggests to Mr. Thompson that Galt may be dead. This leads her to go and find him. And In sequence 4, we find Dagny goes to Galt's apartment. They meet there briefly. As Galt predicts in that encounter, the authorities come to arrest him shortly afterwards, and Dagny needs to pretend to be on the side of the planners as opposed to Galt's side. We'll talk about why that is, to keep herself and Galt safe, and so she does that. In sequence 5, we get Galt's initial meeting with Thompson, Galt now in captivity at the Wayne Falkland Hotel. In sequence 6, we have a lot of things happening. It begins with Thompson talking to his advisors. His initial meeting with Galt hasn't accomplished what he wants. They try to say, who can talk to him? How can we get anywhere with this guy? We then get Thompson talking to Dagny about her views on what they should do with him, how they should deal with him. We also get Dagny's flashback to how she initially told Thompson that she had found Galt for them. We get a number of sequences with different people visiting Galt, trying to make the planner's case to him and get him to cooperate with them. Jim, Morrison, Ferris. Galt at this point requests Stadler. We get a scene of Thompson and Mouch trying to work out how to move forward. We get a very interesting scene with Dagny and Eddie, which I want to spend some time on later, where Eddie decides to go to California to resolve a problem on the railroad there. We get finally the meeting of Galt and Stadler that Galt had requested. And then we get the last sequence of the chapter, which is a banquet that has been put on to announce the completion of a fictitious John Galt plan. There isn't such a plan, but they're announcing in the papers and so forth that Galt's been working with the planners to create this plan. There's this vapid banquet at which Galt is feted, and all these vacuous positive things are said about him, and he is meant to just say, hello folks or something at the end so people can tell who it is, but he manipulates the situation so that people can see that he's there at gunpoint and says, get the hell out of my way, at which point the broadcast of this is quickly stopped, and that's the end of the chapter. Dagny, who is in the audience at the broadcast, sitting at the table with Floyd Ferris and other people that Galt doesn't want to see, so that table's a little out of the way, has some interesting revelations about the different people and their responses to Galt, and we'll talk about that as well. So our agenda for tonight is we'll spend a little bit of time on just the first scene, what goes on in the room with all the leaders of the society and the immediate reaction of Galt's speech. We'll then zoom out and look a little bit at the country's reaction to the speech. Then we're going to talk about Dagny and Eddie, their interaction through this chapter, both in the immediate aftermath of Galt's speech and later in this scene where Eddie decides and tells Dagny that he's going to go out on California on this trip. Then we're going to turn to Thompson and the planners. We'll have talked a bit about them in the connection with the first scene, but we'll talk about how they deal with Galt. We'll then talk about what we learn about Galt in this chapter. The chapter is, after all, named for Galt, the Egoist. And then we'll close by talking about Dagny's thinking as it develops over the course of this chapter. If Axton is right that Dagny has one premise left to check, and Galt is right, as he says in this chapter, that this is the chapter that's going to help her see what their enemies really are, we should expect to see some development in her thinking over the course of this chapter and the next. Well, there are only two others after this. So we want to see how things are going with Dagny. So let's look now, move right into the first scene, and to characters' very initial reactions to the speech. What are the first things said in the room? What immediately happens?
Real, was it? Evasion.
Yeah, it wasn't real, was it, Robert, you say? And who says that?
Mr. Thompson was sitting on a crate.
Mr. Thompson. I didn't, yeah, crate is interesting.
Sitting on a crate after 3 hours. Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't real, was it, says Mr. Thompson. Holloway says, we seem to have heard it. So that's kind of distancing yourself from the reality of it. Morrison says we couldn't help it. And then we get this anonymous character who says, let me out, right? Or something, let me out of here. I forget his exact words. But so yeah, I think a clear theme in this is evasion, not wanting to admit or accept what they heard. I think we'll see various ways in which this evasion is affected throughout this scene and even throughout the chapter. But someone saying, I think just someone in particular is having a sound. problem on his own computer. That's not off. Okay. So Thompson's initial reaction is this, it's not real. What brings him back to being his Mr. Thompson self, and what are the steps by which he gets there? Any thoughts?
Well, once they start going around the table saying who won't go for this speech, they start to feel comfortable with the topic that they're more in control of.
Good. So in general, the people in this room, when they find a topic they can talk comfortably about and they're starting to let their hair down and feel back to themselves, it's the topic of how other people will react to the speech, that other people won't go for it. And the more people say that, the more other people are comfortable saying their favorite demographic won't go for it. But there's something that even happens before that, and in particular, in Mr. Thompson's case. Yeah, Earl.
He grabs his whip.
He grabs his whip, as you put it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, what did you say?
His
And
whip
chair.
and chair.
Whip and chair, so from
And-
the crate
and
to
puts
the
people
chair.
in line.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it, the whip, although he grabs the whip tentatively, right? So when we hear this guy say, "Let me out of here," right? Stay put. And it's when he hears himself in that assertive tone, asserting himself against this guy who wants to flee, there's a line, I forget exactly how it's put, like he's recapturing a familiar version of reality. So Mr. Thompson, and I think everybody, is really shaken. They don't know what to think. What world am I in effect, after hearing this speech? It's not real, is it? He's asserting his authority over the guy is his, gets him back into his sense of what the world is, where I'm in charge and I can put down these people and I have some power over them. After all, he's been out of control for this time. He was supposed to give this speech. He couldn't control the radio station. He couldn't control what was said. He was totally out of his element. And then what happened?
Greg,
Ben,
it's
you
interesting.
had commented. Oh, go ahead, then.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that right after that bit where he regains his familiar version of reality, he starts to ask the question, who permitted it to happen, but then cuts himself off. Of course, the question would have been, who permitted this to happen, but to acknowledge that it wasn't him, that it might have been someone like Galt would have further undermined this same kind of authority that he's trying to assert, it seems. And he doesn't want to go that far. Instead, he says, what do you make of this? And
Yeah, I
that's
think
when we
of
get
what's going on there is slightly different from that. So, I mean, everyone knows Galt broke in, at least everybody in the room. So I don't think what he's trying to get away from is the answer is Galt had no one permitted it. What he's looking for is someone to blame or someone to take responsibility. But what I think is going on, and this is why I said he's tentatively taking back his whip, is every time he's about to give an order or demand something that he sees he's not going to be able to get anyone to carry it out, he backs down and doesn't want to face the fact that he's not in control. So if there was an answer, oh, I'm the one who permitted it, I screwed up, and some guy to take the blame, and then that guy could be punished and he could scapegoat him or whatever, I think Mr. Thompson would have gone ahead with the who permitted it to happen. But what it says is he noticed there was this air of panic in the room. And immediately what Thompson's doing, and everyone else is doing, but Thompson's doing it more so and more overtly that you could see, is trying to read the room. And when he sees that what he's going to get is not people who are deferent to his authority and saying, oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Thompson, I'm the one that did it, but just startled and panicked people, he knows it's dangerous to try to assert his authority in that way. And so he backs down to something more, so what do you make of it? Something
There is
non-committal.
there's a kind of constant oscillation that he has in this chapter between wanting to assert authority and wanting to negotiate. And that's something we're going to talk about a fair bit later. But it seems like when he's in this kind of position where his authority is impotent, that's when he puts on the mantle of the negotiator. But there are various places where the return to just giving orders and making threats breaks back through the cracks. Can't hear you.
He's always been somebody who doesn't fancy himself an authoritarian giving orders, right? He's a kind of folksy, glad-handing kind of guy. So whenever he's whenever he's in a position where he has to bark an order or bare his teeth, that's it's when his back's against the wall. But when his back's against the wall so much that he realizes that doesn't work, then we get this, just he doesn't know what to do. Earl?
Well, I think you could phrase it like this, that John Galt came in and shattered their paradigm, and Thompson loved it. And he's doing as much as he can to just put it quickly together, which to a certain extent he does.
In other words, Thompson loved the paradigm that Galt shattered, and he's trying to reestablish that paradigm. Yeah, I think that's right. He's trying to reestablish his sense of reality, the world as he understands it, where there are certain roles. And so we get this moment where other people now start to get on board with this, Chick Morrison gradually and very tentatively volunteers, people of, dare I say it, mystical sensibilities won't go for it, and so forth and so on. The mothers won't go for it, this one won't go for it, that one won't go for it, and everybody's on a roll, and who bursts their bubble?
Fred Kinnan, once again, says exactly what they don't want said.
Mm-hmm.
Thompson then tries to deal with it by putting Kinnan on the spot, and that doesn't work either.
Right. I find that really interesting too. He says, well then Kinnan, what would you do? And Kinnan's I don't run things here. At that point, Thompson's about to order Kinnan to do something, right? Do something or, suggest something, and then he says somebody, because he realizes he's not going to be able to control Kinnan. Kinnan's not going to answer. And so rather than issue an order that's going to get rebuffed and show his authority to be hollow, he again retreats to a kind of order that can be given.
Something I just thought of. Could there possibly be any link between Kinnan, I don't run things here, and all the people who told Gail Wynand, you don't run things here, prompting him to name his yacht, I do?
I don't know. I mean, I think just that it's slang for who's the boss, and Kinnan doesn't want to be the boss. But that's an interesting linguistic parallel to the Fountainhead. Okay, so what should we do? Who can tell us what to do? Nobody wants to answer. And who then gives us an answer? Dagny. And Dagny's answer is interesting because we now are getting her take on the world. And thoughts on this, Ben? I think we had a thought on it from online from one or two people.
Well, if I follow you, Greg P. Remarked that Dagny's still expressing her optimism here. The reason that she's decided not to quit up until this point is still coming out, that she thinks that the fact of the speech is a sign that the looters' time is up, they'll see the error in their ways, they'll give up, and that is what she recommends. She recommends that they give up. Of course, they're having none of that.
Dagny's perplexed by it. Get out of their way, right? And Earl, you were pointing out that Dagny says this in this scene, and we get Galt saying a more emphatic version of it at the end of the chapter.
You need to switch cameras.
Other thoughts on Dagny's advice or demands to the planners? Her response to Mr. Thompson from the room. I mean, it's a little bit of an interesting tone to it, right? She's telling them do what Galt said you're going to do. But it's with this kind of air of exasperation and why aren't you doing it? He told you what to do. What are you asking what to do for? You want to live, don't you? Don't you see that you're through? There's no other way. Why aren't you doing it? I mean, damn it, you're using a human language. Can't you? You must have understood. You couldn't have not understood. So you couldn't have not understood. Sarah, carry on?
And she states the reason why she thinks they have to accept this. Because the other side of the you wish to live, don't you, is there's nothing but destruction ahead. The world's in your own. So she thinks it's such an obvious, of course you would choose to live. Nobody would choose destruction, so what don't you understand? Right, so it's more than just she assumes they want to live, she assumes they don't want the destruction too.
Good. Yeah. So how does Thompson respond to this?
Stadler jumps in.
Yeah, Stadler.
Oh,
Stadler
good.
jumps in saying,
Don't listen to her.
don't listen to her, yeah, we have to kill him, basically. It's your life.
Well,
His.
the kill is more later, but there's some of it early on. Go ahead, Earl. Did you?
Well, I had just thought that maybe I misremembered, but I thought, because you said she was exasperated and things like that, and I think that's a mask, because I think what frightened everybody was her calm.
Good.
That was the scary thing. She just said, "This."
Yeah, there's two elements. What I was thinking of as the exasperation is she's sort of uncomprehending how they can't see what the next thing to do is, how they're still stalling, and, damn it, don't you see this is the right thing to do? But on the other hand, she has a look of common certainty, the same kind of sound as the voice on the radio had. It's like she's coming from a Galt-like place. And that is in stark contrast to everyone else there, who is, they don't know what to do. They're trying to avoid acknowledging that they heard what they just heard, except for Kinnan, who is kind of bursting their bubble when they try to pretend that. But then he's pointedly refusing to assume any responsibility for doing anything other than shattering the other people's pretenses. Yeah, Carrie Ann?
I think there's one more thing in what she said, which after Stadler has his bizarre outburst, Thompson's response latches onto something that she says, because she says, get out of his way because he knows what to do. You don't. He's able to create the means of survival, and Thompson picks up on that very quickly. He's like, wait, everybody, don't diss him too quickly, because maybe this is a guy we can make a deal with.
There's something Galt has that we need, so we need to find him. She's right about that. He's always trying to find a middle road. And here's a middle road, right? Where Dagny says, get him and do what he says. Well, we won't go that far, but we'll get him, and we'll see what kind of situation we could make with him. The other thing that's interesting to me about Thompson here is when people react hysterically against the speech, which we see Jim Taggart doing and we see Stadler doing, right? He backs away from them and puts them down a bit for doing it. And we, both he seems to like being able to assert his authority against that, but also he seems to be a little bit disturbed by their reacting so hysterically. I didn't think professors went to pieces, he says to Stadler, and pipe down to Jim. And this is also, he wants to be moderate in the middle, controlled, measured, as opposed to the people railing against the speech. Ben, this is really the first occurrence of a thing you pointed out, which is this idea of Thompson being in the middle.
Yeah, well, there's a line in Galt's speech, which we just got done talking about, which seems to describe this situation pretty precisely, and we're going to see even more of it going forward in the chapter, especially when they bring Galt in and try to get him to negotiate with the looters. And the line is that the man in the middle is the knave who blanks out the truth in order to pretend that no choice or values exist, who's willing to sit out the course of any battle, willing to cash in on the blood of the innocent or to crawl in his belly to the guilty, who dispenses justice by condemning both the robber and the robbed to jail. And interestingly, Thompson's going to do exactly that, who solves conflicts by ordering the thinker and the fool to meet each other halfway. And that is also exactly what he does, especially when he brings Galt to the Wayne Falkland. And we see the preposterous example of someone like Floyd Ferris interrogating John Galt. And John Galt, of course, not being willing to do it, but that's something we'll get to. Yeah,
we have Paul online is, I I think, speaking for Dagny when he asks what makes people refuse to see the right answer, what makes them pretend that they want an answer and then refuse to acknowledge it when it's presented. I've never understood that type of person. And I think this could be very much speaking for Dagny and why she has this attitude, well, one, in the whole book, but in this scene towards Thompson and the other people in the room. And we'll have to comment further on that as we track Dagny's trying to find or Dagny's coming to an answer to that question. So Thompson is already trying this middle-of-the-roadism while Dagny's in the room, right? And he notices that everybody's looking at him blankly, her, Dagny, and the other planners when he says, we don't have to go to extremes, let's find something in the middle, don't any of you go to extremes. They can't make heads or tails of what he's doing. He's making some concessions to Dagny. Don't let anyone, think we're your enemies. Thank you for speaking your mind. He's getting something from Dagny, right? She's at least willing to say what to do in a way that none of the other people around him are. And he's hoping that Galt will tell them what to do. And so there's something he wants to and is gravitating towards and making concessions to Dagny. But of course, he's not doing what she's saying, which is getting out of the way. So she's uncomprehending. After she leaves, of course, we get Stadler being more emphatic and Stadler saying, well, what?
That's where he says we have to kill him.
Yeah.
In cold blood. No ifs, ands, or buts about it.
And that he didn't scream it is what makes everyone so chilled by it. Yeah, so he says we have to kill him. And, of course, they can't find him, and Stadler's the one who tells them how to find him, put a tail on that Taggart woman, which Thompson reacts to. But, of course, he's not going to kill him when he finds him because we need him. Okay. So, any further thoughts on this first scene? Ben is, well, first, anyone from the room? Yeah. Will?
Yes, well, what really sums the whole mentality of the looters up is when Maud says we can't accept his ideas, Mr. Thompson, who cares about ideas?
Yeah, that's significant. And this is something I thought we might get to a little later, but it's worth talking about now. How does Mr. Thompson think of people like Mouch? Not even Ferris and so forth, but Mouch.
Calls him an intellectual.
He's an intellectual. He's an impractical idealist.
They're
right?
impractical.
Yeah, so he's, some, whatever, dreamer, intellectual, yeah.
Yeah, I heard a phrase, some spy was using it, and it's called the useful idiot.
Uh-huh.
I mean, the guys that are easily manipulated.
Well, I think all of these guys, Mouch certainly, and maybe Thompson, are useful idiots. But what I find striking here is that Mouch, who earlier in the novel seemed like the most unintellectual guy you could find, just didn't stand for anything, was a zero at the meeting point of a whole lot of other zeros, didn't even really have an agenda. He just, got promoted.
I need more powers.
Except I need more power, but he didn't have anything he wanted to do with it. It's not like he was like a socialist, for example, and had a kind of society he was trying to implement. He was just, someone who was a useful stooge for other people and so got promoted. And Thompson is a similar kind of person, although more self-conscious about it. But now Thompson's view of Mouch is this is an impractical idealist, right? He's a real intellectual, and I can't, he's not practical because he's committed to ideas and doesn't want to compromise with someone like Galt. Ben, shall we move on to the next scene with Dagny, or are there other points from this first sequence that you'd like to say anything about?
Well, so Paul in the chat wonders, what is it that makes people refuse to see the right answer? What makes them pretend that they want an answer and then refuse to acknowledge one when it's presented? I've never quite understood that type of person. And I take it that part of what he's referring to here is the fact that the answer that's just been presented to them, Dagny's, and wider than that, Galt's whole speech, which they've just sat through, seems to be being ignored on a colossal scale here. And I mean, several people in the earlier discussion and just now also, notice it's what And the first thing Thompson says is, that wasn't real, was it, when this was a speech about the importance of paying attention to reality. And that's, of course, not the only instance of that in the sequence or in the rest of the chapter. There's any number of epithets and reactions that people make that seem to be in defiance of anything Galt has said. Morrison says we couldn't help it, as though there's no free will. James says nobody can know anything, there's no right, as though Galt's whole presentation of the rational basis of values had never been given. Notably, Dagny, who otherwise would presumably agree with most of what Galt has said, doesn't seem to be paying attention to his injunction that she quit and leave the looters to their death worship. She still seems to think they want to live. Now, there's some very different, that's a big difference between her and the way the looters are reacting. We had originally asked a question about how do people react and fail to react. And I had thought of many of these as examples of failures to react, though I think you wanted to put it in slightly different terms, at least as far as the looters were concerned.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of the things you might think of as failures to react or not responding to things in the speech are attempts to evade it, as Robert said earlier. It's not real isn't just the same it's not real he would have said if he hadn't heard the speech. It's an attempt to make the speech unreal. And these people all have techniques, and we've been seeing them throughout the book, of avoiding facing facts, or as Dagny put it, avoiding the finality of their knowledge when they have knowledge, when she was thinking about them. And we're seeing them try to marshal these techniques here, I think. So it is a way of reacting to the speech, but it's a way of reacting to it by avoiding its content, rather than responding directly to it. Earl?
Yeah, I have a little bit of a speculative question for you and Ben, and that is these kind of characters. It comes up a little bit later, but these people that actually have nothing to bring to the table, so they control it by buccaneering the table. How many of those people are conscious about it? Like, let's say Jim Taggart thinks he has something to bring, whatever it might be. Jim Thompson might know that he has nothing to bring, so that's why he consciously takes the table.
Ben, did you want to react to Earl's comment there?
Well, this is something that comes up later in the chapter when, after they've tried negotiating with Galt, they're wondering why nothing that they offer him can incentivize him to give them what they want from him. And at one point, Kinnan says, what do we have to offer a man who wants to live? And several of them, I think James reacts quite evasively to that suggestion, saying, why did you say that? What made you think that? So Kinnan is willing to open up a chink there that the rest of them aren't, it seems. But that's something we're going to talk about later, I think.
I think a lot of it is just they know or they don't know, but they're willing to face or they're not. And if there's something that you sort of know but aren't willing to look at directly, there's a way in which you know it and a way in which you don't. I will say the language that you are putting it in, Earl, is evocative of some language she used in her notes when she was planning The Fountainhead. Now, I think she has a much more worked out view of human motivation in Atlas than in The Fountainhead. But in The Fountainhead, she thinks of certain characters as someone who couldn't really be and doesn't know it, and other people as people who couldn't really be and know it, or couldn't be a man and knows it versus doesn't know it. And her character, the main characters, are kind of framed in terms of that kind of alternative. And I think you can think that Mouch doesn't know what he is in the way that Thompson does. Jim is, I think there are more variables going on in Atlas. So it's not just how much they know, there's that. There's also how willing they are to face what they sort of know. And there's also, I think, how much of their motivation is a kind of passive anti-effort motivation, and how much of it is actively hatred-driven or driven by resentment towards the good people. And I think you see some of both in all of the negative characters. But a character like Jim is consumed by what makes him different from a character like Thompson or Mouch, who are more sort of nothings. Isn't that he thinks he has more to bring to the table, but he's I don't think that's primarily what it is. I think it's that a bigger part of his motivation is actually resentment or hatred towards the Reardons, the Galts, the Franciscos, and we've seen this since childhood with him. He always he had a thing against Francisco and Dagny's admiration of Francisco, and I think we see it throughout. Why do you hate Hank Reardon? It almost seems like you hate him from the first scenes with him, and it doesn't make any sense that you'd hate him. He's our best customer, and seems.
For that reason, because they are producers, and he knows he's not, correct?
Yeah, I think they stand as a kind of reproach to him.
Yeah.
Now, they in effect stand as a kind of reproach to Orrin Boyle too, but Orrin Boyle. Orrin Boyle or Coffee Meggs, who's I think lower than Orrin Boyle in this respect, less intellectual, less thoughtful than Orrin Boyle. They, also people like Reardon stand as a reproach to them. But what seems to drive Boyle is, trying to get away with getting a quick buck that he didn't earn. Whereas what seems to drive Jim isn't that. It's putting down his betters, so to speak. And I think that difference is a significant difference among these characters. Some of them have they all have some animosity towards the people who stand as reproaches to them by the way they live. But some of them, they're primarily driven by that. I think Lillian is, Jim certainly is, maybe Ferris. Mouch and Thompson and Boyle, that's maybe in the mix somewhere, but that's not what really comes forward in them. They're just grafters of some sort or another. Grifters, I guess. All right, so we want to move on to talking about the wider world's reaction from the reaction we got in the room. And this we learn really over the course of the chapter, particularly in, I guess it's sequence 3, whatever sequence it is that narrates over the course of, sequence 3, which narrates over the course of a couple of months. Will, you pointed out, and we'll talk about this more in connection with Dagny in a moment, Dagny's idea that the Luthers government won't last 10 days. And that's said on, I guess, November 22nd, when Thompson's speech is meant to be given, and Galt's speech is given instead. But in fact, we get a narration of the gradual, not that gradual, but the effects of this speech ending sometime in early February. And so it's 2.5 months or something like that. They are calling for Galt on the radio, but they're not doing anything like what Galt said. Okay, so what are the effects of the world on the world in general? Well, Alex, who's normally here with us in New York tonight but couldn't make it, says the country's waking up to the truth of Galt's words. The workers of ability are leaving their jobs. Men are shrugging off undue burdens. I think that's a good summary of it. Any particulars under that heading that people or either under those headings or separate from them that people want to call attention to the wider society's reaction? Yeah, Robert.
Well, the pilot who used to fly over Reardon's factory and once he didn't see the light, he quit the next day. That was an inspiration for him.
Yeah, so we're given the different reasons different people quit. A lot of people are quitting. And one of the things we see, and we should spend a moment on, is the sequence of action through which Reardon Steel gets closed and goes out of business. But then that precipitates a pilot who, Reardon Steel was his favorite landmark, seeing it not there motivates him to quit, or maybe it's the symbolic value of that. Other concretes during this progression that stood out to people, or general points you want to make about it?
Well, there would be irrational things where, see, worker in a factory beat up the foreman, right the machinery, and actually the end of Reardon Steel was when someone there, I think, destroyed it.
The 60-year-old man, I think.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yelling to avenge Hank Reardon,
Yeah.
very theatrically.
Yeah, the young guy.
Yeah, so we're seeing some acts of violence, and some of them seem like acts that the author and Galt would approve of. I think this setting fire to something to avenge Hank Reardon, it seems kind of like Wyatt setting fire to his wells, which is something that a striker did, and Reardon, was reluctantly buoyed by, right? And
his morale condition.
but other ones, yeah, Chick Morrison goes around to give a speech, and people are stoning him. Fights are breaking out at places when people say what would have seemed to be innocuous bromides about you're your brother's keeper, or we're all in this together, or whatever it is. Maybe that is self-righteous reactions to what Galt's shown to be evil slogans, and Galt would approve of it. But some of it just seems people are surly and spoiling for a fight.
In these examples of so-called positive, usually violent acts, I mean, the whole civilization is breaking down. We're seeing little acts of sort of frontier justice, but none of it is the acts of good people in a civilized society.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. Society's breaking down. Go ahead.
There are civilized things, but we don't see them. There are lights, but no one goes to investigate.
That's a good point. So there are signs that people are doing the kind of thing Galt said, leaving the society, setting up your own society. There are lights up in the mountains and so forth that look like signs of that.
Even the dollar sign.
People trucking the dollar sign in places or marking it in places. There are also the people who are, you might think it going on internal strike. They're staying at their jobs, but they're just you're not volunteering anything. You can't tell if they're really on strike or they're idiots, and no one can know. Now, we've seen some of this already in response to Directive 10-289 earlier, but we're seeing more of it, and it's the kind of thing that Galt said that people should do. So we are getting the kind of responses which you, I think, can call civilized that Galt called for. We're also getting this society that's breaking down, and we can see that in other ways. Yes, Ben?
I just want to point out that and it's something that I've tried to emphasize before when we've seen these kinds of signs, that this is a breakdown of society that's happening at the same time as the government in charge has, ostensibly at least, its widest power as possible. I mean, it is by every mark at this point of the story practically a totalitarian dictatorship, and this is unique, I think, to Rand's kind of portrayal of dystopia, because you will often when you often look at dystopian literature and the government becomes the totalitarian power, what you have is a society of perfect order, and the literature of that type will then portray the order as oppressive. But this is different. This is very different, and it speaks to something in Rand's own political theory that you've commented on before, about what she takes to be the connection between statism and anarchism. And we'll probably talk more about this at the seminars. But I think this is where you're really starting to see it quite explicit.
Yeah, that's a good point. There are two issues here. One is one that I've raised in the past, but another is a separate one that I think you're really right to point out. One is, a lot of people, particularly people who think of themselves as libertarian, tend to think the opposite of an all-oppressive government that's controlling everything is anarchy, no government. And Rand's view is that anarchy and too much government are very much alike. This is even apart from the fact of the government falling apart. But if you have a government that's in control of everything, what you always have is different gangs fighting each other for control of the government, and power swings around between one gang and the next for who gets to call themselves the public at this time and who gets to sacrifice who to whom. And Rand thought that's what happens in a mixed economy. And she talked a lot about a mixed economy as being a kind of institutionalized gang warfare. So there's that way in which too much government is too little objective order, objective justice, objective laws, and too much people imposing their own wills on one another and ganging up on one another to use the mechanism of the state to do it. But there's another point here also that, Ben, I think you're really right to bring out. That's the one I find more salient in these chapters, which is that the government, it's not just that different people are fighting to control the machinery of the state. The government can't keep control. California's seceding. There are all these little rebellions and insurrections happening places. The government doesn't have the means to exercise this control, and there are all these kind of little rebellions they're always having to put down. Will?
But I was going to say that the Third Reich was a very good illustration of what you were saying, because it was supposed to be a thorough dictatorship, but what happened was every one of the inner circle was trying to expand his fiefdom at the expense of everybody else in the inner circle.
Mm-hmm. And I think you see similar things, to different extents in different totalitarian systems. Some of them are more coherent with one person able to hold on to power more than others, but there's always this kind of tendency of fight for who controls the mechanisms of the state. And there is always this, a lot of corruption, and nobody respects the authority of the state. They might be afraid of it, but they don't respect the rightness of it. And so there is a lot of mafias, alternative gangs, things like this happening. There's a kind of chaos that comes from tyranny.
We also have the situation where people are being taken to jail but let go because there really isn't food for them. And also, back to the lights on hillsides or whatever, no soldiers could be persuaded to investigate the sources of those lights. So the government itself isn't even working at that level.
No, part of that is people have lost faith in the government. They already were losing faith in it. That's why Mr. Thompson had to give this speech. But Galt's now told them what the end game is, right? This government's going to fall. This society is going to fall. It's because we've withdrawn. I mean, there was something wrong with it to begin with that was unstable, but we've accelerated it. And, a new time is coming where things are going to be different. And so I think that's accelerating people's lack of willingness to obey orders. Okay, so let's, shall we move on from these general, is there anything anybody wants to say about the progression by which Reardon Steel goes out of business? This is interesting in its own right. The first attempt at a manager for it is someone from the Orrin Boyle faction. He just pretty much doesn't do much of anything and has a nervous breakdown basically and leaves, begs to be assigned to another post, tries to run it like Boyle ran his company. Boyle himself is now basket weaving somewhere, right? But what's interesting about the Orrin Boyle guy is he's, in some sense, trying to do what you would expect and want if you were someone who wanted government planners, a government custodian of a business to do. He's not really cheating. He's not looting the business to line his own pockets. He's in some sense trying to run it in accordance with these dictates, and he just can't do it. Then we get a Cuffy Meigs type guy who, sells and loots and steals from the business and then disappears. And they can't find anybody who's willing to assume the responsibility of doing it. And this is a more general trend. They can't find anybody willing to take positions of responsibility anywhere.
Jobs of executives.
Right, and
all the labor positions, there's a year waiting list, but
Chip Morrison, I think it was, or Wesley Mount comes up with some medal, order of public benefactor if you'll take a management job. No one will take the jobs, and the few people who do are these Cuffy Meigs sorts who just steal everything and disappear. So these are also symptoms of the society falling apart. Okay, so let's shift to, unless, Ben, do you have anything you want to say before we shift to Dagny and Eddie?
No, go ahead.
Okay, so there are these two major scenes with Dagny and Eddie, right? There's the immediate aftermath of the speech, and then there's the scene with them later. The first one is interesting in giving us both Dagny and some of Eddie's perspective on the speech and what they think is going to happen to the world. And Ben, you had some thoughts on that aspect of the first encounter, I think.
Yeah, well, as soon as they figure out, that, as soon as Eddie reveals that he has known Galt all this time, has been speaking with him in the cafeteria, and is worried about have I been giving him all this information? Have I been helping the railroad or hurting it? He expresses concern that Dagny's going to quit, and she does, have the profile of all the people who have before. But she explains to him that she's not going to do it. And it's interesting how she explains herself. And I want to highlight aspect of the language because I think we're going to see some of it later. She says, should I lose the battle by failing to wait one more moment? How can I let it go? Taggart Transcontinental, Eddie, go forever when one last effort can still keep it in existence. If I've stood things this long, I can stand them a little longer, just a little longer. I'm not helping the looters. Nothing can help them now. Now, there's a lot of things we could talk about there. One is, why does she still want to stick it out even after everything she's heard from Galt? Another question is, why does she think she isn't helping the looters in sticking it out when, plainly they do want to find people like her to negotiate with? And but the one thing I think is interesting is that how can I let it go language? Because this is language we've heard from Dagny in a slightly different form before, when she was first taking the train to Colorado. When she was taking the train to Colorado just before she met Galt. And there's a scene, a kind of poignant scene, where she's looking out the window at the couple having the ice cream on the date and saying, don't let it go. And this is the same language. And we're going to see Eddie use that same language again. I'll just foreshadow for you a little bit. Be on the lookout for where, and think about the significance of this, because this language comes from Dagny. And that was my first observation. The other observation I had is that in the same scene, we get that Eddie realizes that Dagny knows Galt, and it's described as a sudden connection crashing into place in his mind on page 1077 of the standard edition. She turned to him in the ray of a street lamp, raising and holding her face in full light for a silent, deliberate moment, as if in answer and confirmation of his thought. "Oh God, Dagny," he whispered. So it's got to be that what's happening here is that Eddie is figuring out that, because this comes up after he's told her that he told Galt about how he had seen her sleeping, and he had wondered what she looked like. So he's making the connection that Galt wanted to know that because Galt loved Dagny, and now he's realizing that she knows that, and
Dagny knows it because she asked him.
Galt, Eddie has had a tough time with unrequited love in this book.
So yeah, Dagny asks, he says he asked me questions about the railroad, so many questions. This goes for some of us looking earlier at those scenes. We're interpreting how much of what he's saying is really prompted by Galt asking particular questions, or the worker, as we called him then, asking particular questions. Well, Eddie now in his recollection saying, boy, he was asking a lot of questions about the railroad and about you. That's when Dagny asked, did he ever ask you how I looked when I slept? Yeah. So Eddie realizes that, which means she knows him. She's already said, I know he works there, and I know all of this. And then, of course, Eddie remembers, he's asked about when did you last see him, and it was that night when he found out from Eddie that Dagny was sleeping with Hank Reardon, and uncharacteristically broke his composure and ran out. And so now Eddie's putting two and two together, and is realizing that there's some kind of relationship with him. He knows Dagny's been somewhere for a month and wouldn't say where. When she was chasing after the destroyer, now he knows this guy was the destroyer. He loves the railroad, but he destroyed it. And, some other interesting things come out about this. I mean, one is Eddie's pretty perceptive here, I think. He's Robert Mayhew, who's been with us a few times here in New York, points out a few cases in which he seems to be ahead of Dagny on this issue that Dagny's thinking about. Do they value their lives, right? They'll have to, thinks Dagny, they'll have to give up soon. Their state is almost finished. They're through, and they know it. Well, Eddie asks, did they ever act on what they know? And do their lives mean anything to them? These are questions that Dagny sort of is still assuming answers to, answers that Galt and Axton want her to challenge. Eddie seems to see through them. Go ahead.
Yeah, and also, in addition to him seeing that better than Dagny does, he also sees that it's Galt or the railroad. I wouldn't turn Galt over even if it meant even if doing so would save the railroad. He'd be willing to let the railroad be destroyed to save Galt. So he already knows what the right side to choose is.
Yeah, now that's interesting. I don't know if he knows that he's going to be in a position to make that kind of a choice, or that Dagny is. I don't know either of them know that, but he knows that even if it would save the railroad to get rid of him, he wouldn't. So if he has to make that choice, he won't. He won't sacrifice Galt to save the railroad, and that's significant. And if you value his life, don't tell them. Dagny keeps saying there's a lot of do you value him, and both Eddie and Dagny do. Any more thoughts about their first discussion post-speech, or shall we shift to the later discussion?
I've got nothing more. We should go to the next.
Okay, so their later discussion now is, the occasion is Galt has now been captured. Eddie realizes that Dagny will go on strike now as soon as she can, as soon as Galt is free. That's interesting. And it's interesting to think about in this connection, when does Dagny actually switch sides and go on strike? She seems to hold it as a foregone conclusion, as does Eddie, that she will go with Galt when he gets released. And yet she doesn't really seem to have the striker's perspective on the world yet. Actually, that brings me back to something we should really say more about the first conversation before we talk about this second one. Ben, I think you did bring this up, but I want to underscore it. So her view is she's not helping the looters because nothing can help them, and that the looters' government will end within a week. And so the reason that she's going to stay is that she can, if she disappears, the whole railroad will be destroyed, all of its trains will be sold, the track will be torn up, devoured by people like Cuffy Meggs, and when the looters' government is over and the strikers come back, they'll have to come back to a world with no railroad in it, and it would take forever to rebuild it. Whereas if she stays, she can preserve the remnants of the railroad long enough that it will still be there when the strikers come back. Now, that's interesting in itself. She doesn't think she's helping the looters because nothing can help them, so her staying won't delay the state's collapsing. It'll collapse very soon. It does seem like a compromise on a principle. The reason that the looter state is collapsing is because the strikers have gone, but she's gonna try to be the exception. But also she doesn't really seem to have their perspective on what they did when they went, because she's still thinking, if I could hold out a little longer, right? Whereas the strikers don't think about it as holding out to stay in the society. What they're doing is holding out until the society collapses, and then they'll come back. So there's still a pretty fundamental way in which she's understanding what they did as not being able to take it anymore and leaving, and they were fully justified in doing it. But if she can take it, she can achieve a good result by suffering or bearing with it a little bit longer. But she does seem to be convinced, as Eddie is, that she's soon to go on strike, even if she doesn't yet have the striker's worldview, and she doesn't, commit to doing it. But when they have this conversation, the occasion for the conversation is there's the Civil War in California. It's disrupted the service of the Comet because there's some issue over who's in charge of the area where the Taggart Terminal in California, in San Francisco, is. Dagny won't go, Eddie knows, there because she has to stay in New York to deal with the Galt situation. And so Eddie volunteers to do it himself and says he wants to do it. Thoughts on this interaction? Yeah, Robert.
Yeah, I'm down on Eddie. I gotta admit, I'm not a real big fan of Eddie because this, to me, the entire book, he sees Taggart Transcontinental as an intrinsic value, and he takes the title of feudal serf in chapter 1, and here he's doing it again, and he even says that. What does he say? I don't even want to make a new start. Not anymore, not after what I've seen. So John Galt's speech has had zero impact on him, and so I want him to do something. You know, I mean, I understand that he wants to defend Taggart, Transcontinental, against James Taggart and the looters, but I don't see the positive that he goes after. Even the way he leaves Dagny bothers me. Shaking her hand after knowing her for decades.
Well, right along with that, the way he leaves the novel, there he is holding up a brick.
No, don't. Yeah, that's not.
Spoiler. Oh, I thought that was his chapter. Sorry.
So I don't know, and I'm not sold on.
Could I say something about that?
This scene.
Of course, Ben.
Go
ahead.
Yeah, it bothers me that. Okay.
So I'm having trouble finding that passage right now, but I know the one that you're talking about, Robert. And there was a lot of discussion this week in the discussion group about whether Eddie was gulch-worthy, which is an interesting turn of phrase. And on the question of whether he would be admitted into the gulch, into the valley with everybody else. And it's an interesting question, and there's more to come on that question in this book, I think. But it's important that in that same passage that you were referring to, Robert, and again, I can't find it right now, he gives a reason for why he's not ready to start over. He says something like, "Give it with everything I've seen, and I can't start over." And if somebody could find that for me, it would help. But that's important because we've talked already today about how Eddie is in certain ways ahead of the game in terms of his understanding of evil. And this is not the first time in the book where we've seen that. And, is that significant here in his explanation for why he isn't ready to start over again? Is his greater perceptiveness and his greater understanding of the nature of evil something that has demoralized him? And there's a lot of parallels, I think, that we can draw between his situation in this regard and Cheryl's. I mean, Cheryl hasn't heard Galt's speech, but she did have a conversation with Dagny. Dagny gave her some really essential points that also come up in Galt's speech. That wasn't enough to save Cheryl. Is there a similar situation here, and what's the significance of it?
But it wasn't enough to save Cheryl because, in part, Dagny couldn't tell her the whole story. She didn't know the whole story. Right. And Eddie has heard a lot more. He's heard from Galt. He knows Galt. And there are plenty of people in this society who are going on strike, who are following Galt's advice. And Eddie's not. And whatever we want to say about him, I wouldn't say I'm down on him as Robert is. I think, though, we have to acknowledge there were other people, weren't epical geniuses, who were people who were committed to and happy with their jobs and so forth, who did see a way to start over, or at least were willing to look for that new world. Now, there's a question as to what Eddie would have done if Dagny had said, "I am going on strike, come with me." Would he have been willing to start over with her? But even there, it seems like she's telling him, why go to California? What's the point at this point? And he's still indicating she could, I don't know, carry on?
I think part of it, this is the frustration of Eddie, that he's admirable in a number of ways of his loyalty to the good. But he doesn't seem to possess it in his own independent right. Throughout the entire novel, from beginning to end, I don't think I really got a sense of Eddie's own wants. He didn't even admit to himself that he was in love with Dagny for many years. He doesn't have his own sense of what would he have done if there wasn't Taggart Transcontinental. It was always somebody else's dream that he hitched a wagon to, and he would loyally support and defend it. But what are his own wants, his own needs? And that's been eclipsed. There is no Eddie apart from his loyalty to supporting somebody else who is an independent striker type of person.
Yeah, I mean, he does follow his independent judgment in a way, and he will talk back to Jim and he'll assert, but there is a sense in which you don't see any real values that Eddie has that didn't come from Dagny.
Exactly.
Robert?
Yeah, so
And he can't
if you
have
remember when
Dagny.
Francisco
And that's
is
important.
in Reardon's Mills, and he has the talk with Reardon about the kinds of people Reardon built Reardon Metal for. He starts with Ellis Wyatt types, and then he says the Eddie Willers types, but he says they don't have the same brain power, but the same moral integrity. And I don't agree with that. I can't say Eddie has the same moral integrity, because it's more than just defending what I consider an intrinsic value, which is take a transcontinental thing, going out and pursuing his own values. And again, even Dagny would be a value to him, but he just gives her a
This
handshake
idea
at
of
the end.
intrinsic value is a bit of technical terminology. Maybe we should say something about it. It's a word Rand uses in her nonfiction when she's describing different views of value, and her view is that values come from the mind and from the reason and choices of the individual who values something. So you identify something as potentially serving your life, and you commit yourself to it, and those two aspects, the identification and the choice to pursue it, identification of it as potentially serving your life, and then choice to pursue it in service of your life, are what make the thing a value. And that's what she calls an objective value. And she contrasts that to a subjective view of value, where something, you just want something and you don't think about the causes and effects of it, but the fact that you want it is what makes it a value. Or an intrinsic view of value, where you suppose that some things are just valuable, regardless of their relationship to your life and your choice. So in a religious view of value, God's commandments maybe, or would just be values. In a kind of Kantian system of ethics, that your duty would just be a value. But even not in a theoretical sense of ethics, you can just take something that you do value, but fail to recognize the contribution of your own mind and thinking in it, and just treat it as though the value is in that object and it's just worth pursuing, and not recognize how the value of it to you depends on things that you're doing and that you're thinking. Now, that kind of intrinsicism is a kind of error, I think, you can see all of the virtuous characters making, other than the strikers, right? So Dagny thinks of Taggart as transcontinental as it's almost like a living thing. It's so valuable. And Francisco is saying, no, there's a certain context in which it's a value. It's like the corpse of what it was, and it's only a value when it's alive and connected to us. So I don't think the fact that Eddie has an element of intrinsicism about his values is enough to say he's not independent, because even Dagny does. But there is a sense in which he seems less to be the author of his values than she does. The feudal serf language you couldn't imagine in connection with Dagny, for example. And I don't think we can draw a neat bow under this issue of what to think about Eddie. But I think it is really striking here that he's willing to and committed to fighting for Taggart Transcontinental, even in a situation where he thinks Dagny's going to quit. He thinks the railroad will be destroyed after Dagny quits. She is saying, don't do this. What does it matter at this point if the comet runs or not? But he wants to do it anyway. And then the last thing to note about that,
One of his two jobs is Robert Mayhew.
yeah, so Robert Mayhew's, I was going to say the last thing to say about that is the issue of his talking about his love for Dagny. But let's see what Robert has to say. Robert says, wanting to be Steve's job's superb administrative assistant is not a form of dependency, and the same is true for Eddie's passion for TT. I don't think we should assume he has no independent values.
Yeah, Greg, I tend to agree with Robert on this, and And remember that Dagny herself said that she would let the last Taggart train run over her. Earlier in the book, obviously, but I mean, we didn't take that as meaning she didn't have independent values. This is part of the reason I was pushing the idea that there's something that Eddie's faced so much loss, especially with regard to his love of Dagny, that it's not that he doesn't have values, it's that he's losing the will to live because of everything he's lost. And that's part of the reason I was drawing the parallel to Cheryl.
I see. So the idea is he's in effect depressed or despondent or has lost any way to go on. And yet, Galt presented it to everybody in the world is in some sense in the situation of losing whatever was of value to them. And Galt said, you can have a different kind of life. And Eddie's, as Robert puts it, going on a suicide mission. Now, maybe he thinks, look, when he gets back, either the looters' government will be gone and Taggart Transcontinental will be saved, or it won't. If it won't, eventually that'll happen. Whether or not Taggart Transcontinental is saved, he'll know he's did his best for the one love he has in his life that's remaining. Even Dagny thinks you're not really serving the looters by doing it. So I don't think we could put a neat bow under what's going on with Eddie here. But I think all these thoughts are to the point of trying to understand him. As to his not having independent values, I didn't think it. All I mean by that is we don't see in Eddie any values that aren't connected directly to Taggart and Dagny. Whether or not he has them, I don't know. But I don't think you could assume just because his goal in life is to be Dagny's second, so to speak, or his assistant, that he doesn't have them. But we're not shown them that there's anything else in his life, right? He has the lonely, scrupulous little man with a scrupulous apartment. He doesn't, and that's interesting. Now, maybe he's a victim of a kind of society that he's in where there aren't any values he can see around him to pursue. But part of understanding Eddie is this kind of loneliness and bewilderedness, and he's in this world he doesn't know what to do with. Yeah.
But I think we should move on, Greg, because we've got about 40 minutes left.
Let's talk about Mr. Thompson and the planners a bit, and then Galt and Dagny. So a few points I wanted to make about Thompson. I mean, it's worth noticing how the significant amount of this chapter is from or quasi from Thompson's perspective. We have a third-person omniscient narrator who is sometimes in the heads of some characters, and we see scenes more or less from that character's perspective. We get the first scene largely from Thompson's perspective, and several others, and I find that interesting. What do we know about this guy? Well, from when we first met him, he's a sort of unambitious schemer, right? He's constantly scheming. He's scheming to get more power, but he's doing that because that's what's expected of him by the various people who are behind him in different ways. So he's not a power luster in the sense of someone who yearns for authority. He's someone who sort of found himself in this role. This is what's expected of him. This is what he does. He's not intelligent or passionate about anything, but he's crafty about manipulating people and getting power. He's totally non-ideological. He doesn't have some, program or goal that he's after. And he looks at people with this glance as if to say, what's your angle? So he's always trying to size people up and see how we can make a deal with them, how we can get somewhere with them. And I think that's kind of the lens we have to view the guy through. Now, we've already talked a little bit about his attitude towards some of the other looters. He regards Wesley Mouch even as an ideologue. Then we had a few other comments on this connection from the forum. Do you want to take us through them?
Well, there were a couple of little debates that broke out about his attitude toward the other looters. So Greg P., for example, proposed that that Thompson regarded the other people in his circle as incompetent. So that's why he thought that they needed Galt. David took issue with this, thinking the issue here wasn't the competence of his circle. The ideology is what they've been basing all their policies on. Separately, then Keith mentioned that it looked to him like Thompson was the sort of person who just wanted to go through the motions, didn't have values or plan, expected things to continue on their normal course as long as he stayed the course. Though David also disagreed with that, suggesting that he wouldn't think that he wouldn't be saying that they need Galt and that they'll perish without Galt if he indeed thought that things would just continue if he kept going through the motions. It is true, I think, that he's got a script that he likes to stick to. This is what we talked about earlier, where he recaptures his sense of reality when he goes back into negotiator mode. But I mean, the stakes of winning this this negotiation have upped significantly here, and I think he knows that there's something special here, and that some special action is required.
I don't think that's so different from his knowing that his circle is incompetent. He knows that there's something his circle can't do, which is give him answers, right? He doesn't know how to do things. He doesn't know how to accomplish things. He doesn't know how to have answers. What he does is kind of manipulate people into doing the work for him, and yet somehow gets to call the shots, but without the one who's coming up with any of the ideas or programs. And at this point, nobody in his circle can come up with any ideas or programs. Even at the time of 10289, right, Mouch and others were coming up with Directive 10289, and Thompson was saying, all right, go ahead with it. But now, these guys don't have any programs to put forward. They don't have anything to suggest. When he asked Fred Kinnan, well, what would you do? Kinnan says, look, I don't run the show. Mouch has become a smear of an oval at his knee. Nobody's giving him, everyone knows they're out of ideas, with the exception of Ferris and a few others who are brutal in a way that Thompson is afraid of. And even most of their ideas are how to capture Galt and torture him into doing something, or get him into doing something. This kind of persuasion won't work, and so forth. We have to take stronger measures, is the kind of thing Ferris is liable to say. So you can't make deals with people. So he knows that there's something he needs that he can't get from his people, which is answers. And that's why when he sees Dagny with a Galt-like certainty, he finds something reassuring about her. It's also why later, when Dagny's faking it to him, he wonders why he found something reassuring about her. Go ahead.
He likes that she asks for the check, because that is
good.
What makes her tick. He's
right.
looking out for that.
So he's on the premise of he wants to know what makes people tick. He wants to know what's your angle. Mm-hmm. When Dagny asks for the check, it's he knows what makes her tick, and it's a kind of ticking that he can deal with. Now, that's, I think, at a separate... There were two issues going on in his relationship with Dagny. Some of the times, it seems like she's someone who has answers and has certainty and knows what to do and can tell him what to do, unlike his advisors who, he says, you're smarter than any of those boys, right? So sometimes she seems like that. And so she wants to be able to control her and make her tick, know what makes her tick, to control her when she's like that and get those answers from her. Other times, like in much of this meeting, she doesn't seem to be like that anymore. She seems to be like the other faces. Also, sometimes he doesn't know what to do with her or what makes her tick. He's right before Galt's speech. She refuses to sit where she's supposed to sit. And his response is, you won't? He's kind of incredulous. He doesn't know how to deal with her. Now he does think he knows what makes her tick. And so he's happy about that. So there were two kind of variables going on for him with Dagny. So what about Thompson's attitude towards Galt?
Thoughts?
Oh, yeah. Go ahead, Ben.
On Thompson and Dagny, relating to things we've learned from Galt's speech, when he... not just in relation to Dagny, but also with the looters, when he pushes back against the other looters who want to use really drastic measures like Ferris, and when he pushes back against Taggart, who says there is no right, nobody can know what's right or wrong, there I see the need for self-esteem coming out, that nobody has a choice about whether they need self-esteem, and even a pragmatist like Thompson can't stand the realization that he might be a killer and that there's nothing right about what he's doing. So that's one thing. But then there's another dimension of that same point, I think, that you see when he's reassured by the fact that Dagny wants money, because he thinks that everybody's got an angle. And there's several other characters in this. Whenever anybody says we couldn't help it, they're implicitly invoking a kind of determinism, and when invoking some kind of phony moral ideal no longer works to save their self-esteem, now they can say, well, I couldn't help it because I had to, I didn't have a choice. That also helps shore up pseudo self-esteem, not because you think that you're doing the right thing, but because you think that you literally had no choice and you couldn't be expected to make the right choice. And I think both of those are part of what go into his psychology here.
Good. Turning to Thompson's attitude towards Galt then. I mean, once he has Galt in his clutches. Anything stand out to people about this they want to comment on? So first, he's excited for Galt to agree with him that he's a practical man or a man of action. Right? He's always saying, I don't understand you. Boy, I'm confused by you. You're quite an orator. I don't know. You got the country all riled up. He's expressing this kind of folksy, tickled Pete to meet you. I don't quite understand what kind of a guy you are. Some of that is genuine. I think he knows he doesn't understand him. He wants to, right? So he's looking for, or he wants to know his angle anyway. He's confident at first, although not all that confident, that he's a man of action and a practical man. So therefore, there will be a way for them to cut a deal, right? Unlike an impractical idealist who wouldn't be able to make a deal that his advisors are telling him Galt is. No, I don't think you're practical, he eventually says when Galt won't make a deal with you. Other thoughts on what he's doing or up to in his conversation with Galt? Robert?
Yeah, he's also trying to find if Galt has a girlfriend, if he has any values that he can torture, which is Galt anticipated that. And so we're learning how he's risen up the ladder by this manipulate, as you said, knowing what makes people tick. And the formula's not working with Galt. Mm-hmm. So
I want you to get comfortable in nice suits and so he's looking for things he can bribe him with. When that doesn't work, he's looking for, is there anyone you want to see? Surely there's someone, a girlfriend, relatives.
Greg?
Yeah.
On that very issue, it makes me wonder when Galt says, oh, there is somebody I want to see, Stadler. Is this because Galt knows what Thompson's trick is and actually wants to use it against Stadler and wants to make Stadler come under the threat that they're going to hold him as a hostage?
That's occurred to me too. I think part of it is he wants to come face to face with Stadler, but I think part of it might be he wants to put Stadler in that position.
Your mic just went off.
We had a few online comments about this, didn't we? About Thompson and Galt.
So Seth commented that Thompson was like a used car salesman trying to sell Galt on saving the country, and David doesn't disagree, but notes that he only pretends to be civilized when circumstances are out of his control, but then eventually gets less civilized, threatens Galt with violence when that's not working. And that's what you see at the end of their conversation when it looks like he doesn't have anything to offer Galt. And so the only thing he can think of is, well, I control whether or not you get to leave this room.
Yeah, there's a lot there. And we should talk how Galt responds to that. But before we do that, we should cover the scene with Galt and Dagny because that gives some context for it. One other thing I find amusing about the first Galt-Thompson scene is how it ends. I think this is the only time we hear Galt use his own catchphrase, right? Mr. Thompson, I can't understand you. I don't get what makes you tick. And Galt, who is John Galt? Which is cute and kind of fun.
He shrugs. Without a shrug,
Yeah, he says it with a shrug. Let's talk a little bit about the other planners' attitudes towards one another and towards Galt before we get back to Galt and Dagny and that kind of more central characters. There was some discussion online about Kinnan. I don't know, Ben. Is there anything you want to say on that?
Well, the conversation that there was about Kinnan echoes what the frequent comment that people have made that he seems to be more honest than the other looters. Greg P. in particular said that highlights the fact that he thinks that Galt talks straight. He's the one who says that we have nothing to offer a man who wants to live Greg wondered if maybe Kinnan had absorbed the point of Galt's speech, though Harry pointed out that, remember, Kinnan is hardly innocent in this situation. He's gone along with the Luder government for a while now. In particular, he's the one who got Losi into power with Taggart Transcontinental and is indirectly responsible for the tunnel disaster.
Kinnan's interesting because he's less evasive than the others. And part of him kind of longs for honesty, right? It was nice to see a man who spoke straight. You think of Kinnan as somebody who maybe could have been better, has a part of him that responds to the good, doesn't long to destroy Galt at a visceral level in the way that we see, or doesn't hate him or loathe him at a visceral level in the way that I think Taggart does, and kind of admires and respects him, but knows that he's sold out, that Kinnan has sold out and is on the other side, knows that in this battle, when he wins, right, says Kinnan. So Kinnan doesn't have any illusions. He thinks Galt's got us, Galt's going to win, and he wouldn't have any use for me. So Kinnan thinks, in effect, it's too late for him to come over to, even if he did try to go over to Galt's side, Galt wouldn't want him. I'll be the first to go when he wins. And I think that's probably true. I think Galt would think of Kinnan as having done evil beyond repair, wouldn't be interested in him, and yet he still he's honest enough to, at least in these kind of moments, admit that. And notice he's not still angling for the evil here, right? In the Directive 10-289 meeting, where he's refreshively direct, he's still trying to control people. He's saying, look, I'm not responsible for the kind of world it is, but I'm going to try to lord it over. And he's lying and evading. He could go on strike. He could tell his men not to support this. He could tell his men what kind of measures this is. But he's, in fact, actively working for this kind of tyrannical regime to come into place. Here, he's beaten, he knows it, and he's owning up. And so in that sense, you could think of him as a little better. Jim and Lawson, I think, are interesting characters. Jim has this kind of hysterical, emotional reaction to Galt. How can he think he's so right? How can he be so certain he's... And Lawson has another kind of hysterical reaction to him. You can't rob me of my faith in humanity. He doesn't want to give up his worldview, right, which Galt is a kind of affront to in some way. Lawson is the... banker with a heart, I believe, as we initially met him. He's the one who Dagny in her thoughts described as having a charity lust, which leads to the same kind of things as Miggs's loot lust. And what's interesting here is that Jim, and we've seen other cases of this, when someone's more hysterical than Jim, as Lawson often is, and more bothered by the things that Jim is bothered by than Jim is, Jim seems to enjoy it and want to goad them on. Well, what are you so afraid of, Gene? This is an interesting little aspect of Jim's character. Ferris, of course, is just a brutal and seems to want to kill people and it's disgusting. And what's interesting is he's the only person of the people, because all of these people or as many of them as can be, are paraded by Thompson in front of Galt. He's the only one Galt won't respond to. Galt talks about him in the third person to Thompson, have him look in the mirror. And so that's interesting. So Galt regards Ferris as contemptible in a special way. Yeah, Ben?
Somebody in the discussion earlier mentioned that, remember, Ferris is the biologist who's studied fear in animals. And, of course, he's the one who wants to use this kind of torture, some kind of torture on Galt. And I can't remember who it was, but they remarked how appropriate that Galt should be in such control with Ferris that not only is there no fear, but that he doesn't react at all to anything that Ferris is saying to him. So it's it's definitely not a kind of stimulus response setup as Ferris would expect it to be.
And then Stadler is the last of these. He's the only one Galt requests. And there was some discussion online about the Stadler exchange.
Yeah, a few interesting comments. Greg P. mentioned that while most looters can't handle conversation with Galt, Stadler's not only not able to handle it, but melts down in front of him. Betsy points out that he begins by complaining that he's the victim of people who are impervious to reason, but then he himself says he can't live by reason, can't live by logic in this world. And David says that that last admission gives the lie to his initial claim that the looters' plan would have worked if only Galt hadn't quit. They could have controlled the economy. Well, if you can control the economy, or sorry, if you don't think we can go by reason, how do you expect to control the economy?
Okay, so let's cut to the scene with Galt and Dagny. And we had asked about Galt's reaction to Dagny's coming. We didn't really get all that much on that topic, but Ben, you had some thoughts about it.
Yeah, well, I thought that it was really interesting that the first thing that Galt remarks on when Dagny, when he meets Dagny at his apartment, is what she's wearing. He comments on the dress she's wearing, and he gives her fashion advice for the next time he sees her. Only then he says, if there is a next time. And I mean, you've been on the premise of pointing out what is really distinctive and individualistic about Galt's character, because I think a lot of people miss it. But this is it. I mean, this is this kind of unique combination of lightheartedness on the one hand, but seriousness on the other hand is kind of his hallmark. And it connects also to the scene that we get in just a few more beats where she enters his apartment. She sees the newspaper cutout of her in this pose, and he comments on how this is the way that you look in this picture. This is the way most people don't go their whole life experiencing. I wanted to make this the constant presence in my life, the constant sense of life. And I mean, it really speaks to the overall benevolent sense of life, this benevolent universe premise that we've been talking about, especially toward the beginning of part 3, and how that is distinctive to Galt. And it's important because this is in this very moment, they know that the looters are bearing down on them, and he's about to be arrested. So he's not only talking about what she looks good to wear, but also this overall benevolent universe premise, in spite of the fact that he's about to be arrested. And you see the same, much the same kind of attitude under pressure in these interview scenes with looters that we were just talking about, the joke at Thompson's expense, for instance.
Yeah, the special element of it when he's with Dagny is, right, he's had 1 month with the woman he loves in his life. And then this one other encounter where they consummated their relationship, he doesn't know these people are going to come to get him. He may die, right? He came back to the world to win this one value. So this is a very precious thing, this little bit of time he gets with her. And it's not that, I mean, there's a kind of lightness to how he is with it, because he wants to mark that, look, it was worth it. I had you in my life. And I'm not going to let the only half hour we can have together just be about the tragedy and the horror in the world that has to do with it. I love you, and this matters. And life is about the values that matter to you. It's about motivation by love, motivation for the things that give your life meaning. And this is one of them. This might be the only half hour I get with you again, right? So,
and on top of that,
yeah, go ahead.
On top of that, Greg, a couple of people commented in the earlier discussion. Seth said it looks like he's been preparing for her arrival. He knew that the looters were on her trail. He had the sound lock ready to go and everything. And Greg P pointed out, he remarks, he'd be disappointed if she had not come. Now, this is in spite of the fact that he told her not to come, in spite of the fact that he knew that he would be threatened with this very situation if she had, because he knew they'd trail her. But even still, he's glad that she did, in a sense, because he gets to spend this time with her, as you were just remarking.
It underscores what they mean to each other and how important it is. She, after all, is the only one who broke him. He set a decision for himself and he broke it. That she can't, he knows she's trying not to come. And so to see how much she wants to be with him, it underscores that. The other thing that's similar to the commenting on the outfit, which I like, is when the door knocks and it's the police coming, right? Her immediate impulse is to pull away from him because they're startled by the door knock, and his response is to pull her in closer for the few seconds they have before they answer the door. Let me just give a recommendation on Galt's character and these scenes in particular. There's a very nice essay by Shoshana Milgram called "Who Was John Galt? The Creation of Ayn Rand's Ultimate Ideal Man," which is in this book, which I'm often recommending, Essays on Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged. Shoshana has a couple of essays in this book, one on Francisco also, where she talks about, how the character evolved in the outlines and the drafts, and that material in that chapter is interesting. But also this chapter comments in particular on this scene and one or two other scenes where the elements of Galt's character that we're talking about now are really cast in stark relief. A couple of other things that are interesting that are going on in this scene, right? I just want to point out, first, Galt, immediately and quickly sums up what's going on. Here he makes the point that he knows the looters are going to come. Dagny says if, he keeps saying when. No, that it's going to happen when the agents come. And he thinks this is going to be the thing that's going to convince her. Now she's going to have to play along with them in order to help him. He tells her what to do. And he thinks this will be, this final gambit, I'll be the pawn in the final scene that will play out and will show you what they really are and will help me win you from them forever. So that's his perspective on what's going on. The second thing I really want to point out about this scene is Galt's view of what will happen if they know what they are, if the looters know, the planners know what Dagny and he are to each other, which is that they'll put Dagny on a torture rack, they'll threaten her to try to get him to comply with them, because the only leverage they have is what you love, and they don't know of anything Galt values, right? But if they knew of her. And Galt's solution is that he would kill himself at that point, to not let that situation arise. Now, Rem, you had a comment or two on that, I think.
Yeah, look especially at the language that he uses to make this point, that even though he wants to live, he doesn't care to live on their terms. That's on page 1091. We've seen this before in the chapter. The poll takers that Chick Morrison's morale conditioners send out find that people won't believe anything, they won't react, and they say these are men who don't want to live, or who don't care to live, or who don't care to live on present terms. And it's in contrast to the description of Stadler, who, when he's explaining why he doesn't want to live why he doesn't think you can live according to reason because of the way people are in society, he says there's no way to live except on their terms. You get that terms language at least 3 times in this chapter, and this is going to connect to something I want to come back to later about with regard to the title of the chapter, but let's hold off on that.
Good. So, yeah, there's also, what he says is he would kill himself because there'd be no values left for him to pursue after that. That is, after seeing Dagny being tortured and him having to make this choice of complying with the looters or letting Dagny be tortured. Alex online a few minutes ago when we were talking about Eddie made, I think, a comparison here that Galt thinks in this condition of having let Dagny get tortured, there'd be no values left for him to pursue. He would have, in fact, destroyed himself. There'd be no life for him left to live after that. And so he would rather kill himself than let that happen. Alex suggested if Eddie gave up on the railroad, he would be in the same position, or maybe he thinks he would. And that's an interesting thing to think about in trying to understand why Eddie thinks it's so important for him to do this. I'm not sure if that's right, but it's I think, an interesting perspective on,
I also think that's
why does this matter so much to Eddie. Galt brings this issue up in another way when he's dealing with Thompson, this issue of don't want to live on certain terms. Galt, who thinks life is the ultimate value and the standard of value, right? And your own life is your ultimate value and man's life is the standard of value. From his speech, Galt would kill himself under a certain condition to prevent Dagny from being tortured, we now know. And when he's with Mr. Thompson, right, Mr. Thompson threatens him. He says, you can't get out of the room without me. And he says, if you think we're all going to perish on our present course and you're not, going to help us change course or tell us what to do, and you're with us, aren't you going to perish too? And shouldn't that motivate you to do things differently? Don't you want to live? And Galt's answer is what? Yes, I want to live passionately. I'll tell you what, I know I want to live much more than you do. You don't want to live, which Thompson's kind of queasy of, no, that's not true what you said about me, right? You don't want to live. But because I love it so much, I'll accept no substitute. And this goes to, what does Galt understand it to be to really be living, and the kinds of issues we were talking about in the supplemental session from Boston. We're definitely going to have to talk about what is man's life according to Galt, and what is it to love your life as one of our topics in one of these at the end sessions. But I think that's really striking. So let's end, we have about 10 minutes left, on thinking about Dagny's progression through this chapter. Particularly Dagny's progression in her understanding of the planners, which is what Galt thinks she has a need to progress about, and her understanding of the society in general. And so I think we can put this in a few moments. There's her initial understanding of all these people at the beginning of the chapter, right after hearing Galt's speech, what she expects of them, how she's understanding them, how that's factoring into her plans. There's then, after she's with Galt, and she's now faking as Galt, on Galt's instructions, pretending to be on the looter's side, and she's going through this experience of faking things for them. And then there's finally the last scene in the banquet. And Ben, we had some thoughts from the people on Facebook about Dagny's perspective in each of these conditions. So let's take them one by one, and we'll get comments on Facebook, anything from the people in the room, and then we'll go to the next one.
First, for the initial reactions, Will and Greg P. both commented again on her kind of excessive optimism immediately after the speech, thinking that the looters would quit because of this. Greg, in particular, was getting so fed up with this that he thought Galt was going to dump her. We'll see if that really turns out to be true. Harry highlights the quote that I mentioned before about how can I let it go, says she just wants to hold out a little longer, doesn't think it's about the looters. Seth thinks that this means that at this point she still thinks everybody wants to live, though she's starting to raise questions about it. Harry thinks that her view about whether everybody wants to live maybe starts to change when she sees Thompson indirectly threatening Galt's life by saying, I hope he's still alive. And I would point out, it's interesting that so obviously what happens is she realizes this threat and starts to fear for Galt's life, and that's why she goes to look for him on the East River. But even then, she's still saying to herself, this is my life, this is my love, this is my railroad, there's no conflict between them. So she still doesn't think that she needs to quit at this point. Then when we move to the next sequence, after she's met Galt, after she's pretending to fake, the doubts
then
grow.
Robert wants to get a word in here, I think.
Oh, yeah.
You think
Go
we
ahead.
froze? Robert was just saying he thought we might have had an internet problem, but it's not true. It looks like
I think we're
fine.
okay.
So continue on, or unless does anybody else have anything they want to add about Dagny's perspective prior to Galt's capture? Earl?
We're the same. This is a pure interjection, but I want to do it very quickly. I know we're running out of time, but just as an artist, I want to say one of my favorite scenes in the entire book is when the goons force the copper thing and the sound of the dustification inside. And she presents that incredibly beautifully, and I just want to offer Ms. Rand a bouquet for doing that.
And I love that it's copper.
Yes. So that's a very moving scene. That's it.
Okay, thanks. Ben, carry on.
Right. So we'll move on to the sequence after they meet, after she meets Galt, where she's now pretending to be on the side of the looters. David pointed out that in doing so and in accepting that check and in not really thinking that the money makes any difference, she experiences the state of having a non-valuing soul and realizes that this is the state of most of the people that she's living with and wonders if they want to live. David also pointed out that, remember, Francisco had said, would you still run those trains if they were empty? And it's at this point that she's starting to think that the people on her trains are not living or human. I think it's important that
connection.
Yeah.
This connection between whether you're a valuing soul, whether you're a valuer or not, and being human is something we've seen before, right? It's what Reardon realizes about his family. They don't want to live. If they did, they would have known how to value him. He starts seeing them as non-human at that point. So we've seen this connection before. And I think in particular this non-valuing soul passage, it's here, I think, where you really see her start to question, do these people want to live, start to get an insight into their consciousness. And I focus on that passage a lot in the essay Discovering Atlantis, in that same Essays on Atlas Shrugged I'm always recommending, where I kind of try to trace the steps of Dagny's development and earlier Reardon's.
And I was just going to finish up on that point, Greg, by pointing out I think it's important that it's specifically the assuming the role of a deceiver, having to fake reality, that is putting her in the state of this kind of non-valuing soul. Because now she's having to make herself think like somebody like James Taggart, who has to induce this inner fog. And if you remember, right before she leaves the valley, when she's explaining why she's going back, she says, and you just did something to the notes, so I lost where I was. She says that she can't believe that others can't see that they don't value their lives. I can't believe men can refuse to see. They still love their lives, she says. She's seeing these as joined, the choice to think and the choice to live. And of course, that's what Galt says is the last premise she needs to check. And of course, Galt elaborates on that in the speech, where he says, the question to be or not to be for human beings is the question to think or not to think. And now she's experiencing what it's like to choose not to think, to be a deceiver. That's why she's starting, this is making her wonder if they still value their life.
Yeah,
and then we get to the last
issue
sequence
of the trying to get the secret of their consciousness. She doesn't understand the mode of consciousness of people like Jim and the others. And so I think it's right. There's this connection between their whole perspective on their world, the whole way of thinking, their whole type of consciousness, and this issue of whether they value or not. And I think that's very much right. It's when she's having to approximate their mode of consciousness to deal with them in this way, as Galt wants her to, and that's giving her an insight into them.
And then the last sequence, her reflections during the banquet, where Galt is up on stage. They've got him in front of the world on a camera. She's looking at the audience, looking at Galt. David remarks that at this point she feels a touch of cold horror as the nature of the souls of the people around her becomes real to her. She's seeing their hatred for Galt and for his capacity to live. Alex in the chat right now mentions the same passage. And then I think Harry ties things up for us, because with all of this in her mind, she remembers Galt's question, do they want to live? Well, in answer to her own question, do they want to live, she remembers a line from Galt's speech, the desire not to be anything is the desire not to be. And that's, I think, her answer. If it seems like they don't want to be anything, they don't like this definite pose, this definite stance that Galt is taking toward reality. They don't want to have to assume that on their own, and they don't want to be anything.
I think that's really important, what it is about the people that Dagny is noticing as she looks around the room. And she's noticing that there are some people who just seem not to see any difference between Galt on the one hand and Mouch or Thompson on the other. They're just kind of dead to the issue of values, and they don't care about it. There are other people who do see it and seem to like there's something in Galt that they respond to positively. And you can think of Kinnan as someone maybe who's like this, and a lot of other people who might be less bad than Kinnan, who there's something about Galt that they like that's refreshing to them, that's positive, but they're not.
Thompson for a moment.
Even Thompson maybe for moments, yeah.
He's a real man.
Mm-hmm. But they're not willing to do anything about it. And they're not willing to existentially act to help him. And they're also not willing to reform themselves to try to live up in whatever way they can to what he represents. And do people like that want to live? the people who see that there's something to this life, that there's something to Galt, but they're not willing to lift a damn finger to get it for themselves. Do they really want to live? Galt thinks that Thompson doesn't. And then there's this other kind of person. She couldn't believe it for a moment. And she noticed that Jim was one of them who seemed to hate him. And when Mouch's face is on display, they're relaxed in what's the equivalent to this kind of person of pleasure, a kind of state of license where things are easy and nothing's demanded of them. But when Galt's face is on with this rigid definiteness, Ben, that you were talking about, it gives them a sense of responsibility and that they're not willing to rise to the occasion. But they're not just passively not willing to rise to it. They resent it. They resent the idea of having to rise to it. They resent that imposition on them. They not only aren't assuming the responsibility of being anything in particular, that frightens them, and they loathe that, and they resent that maybe they should be something. And they hate Galt. And that, she asks herself now with a note of mockery in her internal monologue voice, do they want to live? The other ones are like, do they want to live? But this is obviously someone like that doesn't want to live, and that's really striking. I think Alex had a comment. Ben, do you want to read that while I go to Carrie Ann and see what she had something I think she wanted to say on that?
Well, that was the one that I was referring to earlier, where she was referencing the same passage about how they hate his capacity to live.
Oh, I see. Do you hate him for being himself? All right. Any last thoughts on this issue of what Dagny's realizing in the banquet? If not, Ben, do you want to take us out on the points you wanted to make about the chapter title?
Yeah, I can do this pretty quickly. So the chapter title is called The Egoist, and the term egoist gets thrown around by a number of different characters in the chapter. So Thompson's, I think, one of the first to do so. He, negotiating with Galt, says, "You're an egoist. You're a practical man. So why don't you want anything from me? Why can't I, in effect, bribe you?" And indeed, Galt is somebody who, if he's an egoist, he's one who would commit suicide if Dagny is going to be threatened. He wants to live so passionately, he'll accept no substitute than the life that he wants. Stadler, by contrast, is somebody who's willing to live at any cost, accepting the terms of society. So who's the real egoist here? Is it Galt or is it Stadler? And I think that we get an answer to that question, at least from the author's perspective. Interestingly, also from James Taggart's perspective, when he finally is brought into the conversation with Galt and condemns Galt precisely because he's holding on to his ideals and condemns them as selfish. He says Galt should sacrifice his mind to join them and that it's selfish not to. And so by these terms, it doesn't look like Taggart would regard Stadler as an egoist, and that would make it good in his mind. But of course, we know what the author thinks of Taggart and his view. I think the author thinks that Galt is an egoist, and this is what it really means to be an egoist, to accept life on nothing but your own terms.
Yeah, and in that connection, maybe I can just make one more comment and we'll close on something that you made me think of, Ben, when you're talking about Thompson's dealing with Galt. Because you're an egoist, we should be able to make a deal, right? And Galt's answer to that, of course, is, I'm always happy to make a deal with anyone who has anything to offer me. So Thompson's all excited, well, I could write you a check, name how much you want. And one thing I think that's interesting that we see in that discussion, and we didn't really flag it earlier, so I just want to flag it now as we're closing up, is Galt goes through all the ways in which all of the things that Thompson could offer him depend on him, Galt, creating the value of what's offered. And he responds to a lot of arguments against that. I pay for values, not for the removal of disvalues, right? And Thompson says, well, you'd pay a doctor to fix your broken leg, not if he's the one who broke it, right? And so forth. So we see what Galt thinks that being an egoist means in dealing with others. We've seen this before, but now we see it directly in his dealing with somebody who's, as Galt puts it, trying to hold a zero as mortgage over life, whose only thing he has to offer him is destruction or refusing from destroying him. And in the speech, Galt talked about, no amount of refusing to destroy will raise a single girder. And here we get to see him acting on it. So this is another occasion of a connection between Galt's speech and his actions. It's not selfish, it's not egoistic to establish someone in a protection racket. And
your fear of death is not the same as a love of life, he also says in the speech. So merely acting against that fear is not loving one's life either.
Right, and that's the connection with Thompson when he says, I know you don't actually love it. All right, so I think that's all we have time for today. We'll be back next week to discuss Chapter 9. Same configuration as here in New York, Ben joining us from Louisiana, and Chapter 10 the week after that. And then we'll have, I hope all of you in the room and many of you listening online will be able to join us on Sunday, the 22nd, I think it is, Ben, for a little mini conference where we're going to be looking at the novel as a whole and reviewing, many of the themes that we keep having to put off and say, we'll get to that later. It'll be our last chance for that. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.